Welcome everybody to the February 6th School Board Budget Workshop, very first one. Tonight we will have a presentation given by our Finance Chair, John Boltz. We'll begin with the opportunity for questions from the public. And then as John goes through the presentation, if there's any questions that have been presented up front, he will try to address them in his presentation. Otherwise, at the end, we will close and allow any town councilors who remain, thank you, Jamie, for being here, if they have any questions that you have on the spot from tonight's presentation, to feel free to ask them as you go along. And with that, I think, John, if you're ready, we'll let you.
Well, you better give it.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
How would you start with a brief
Okay,
overview?
sorry. Sorry.
Good evening, everybody, and I'm happy to kick off this budget season. My impression is that tonight we want to primarily focus on enrollments and talk about how enrollments have a major influence on our staffing and our budget. There were some handouts tonight that you'll have a chance to look at and to digest over time, but it shows an interesting trend over years of our enrollments going back to the year 1999 and 2000 up to present. And clearly it swung up, and clearly it's swung down, our enrollments over those years. Like in most schools in Maine, the year 2004 or 5 was the highest enrollments in recent years. That's true across the state. And after that, they started to tick down. And at that time at Cape Elizabeth, we had 1,847 students. And if you compare that number against where we are today, we're down total enrollments by about 248 students. If you look at 5 years ago, where we are compared to today, we're down 48 of that earlier number, not an additional number. If you look at the last 3 years, we're down 4 students. So I am taking that, the way I interpret this is that right now we are at pretty much at a flat number, and I think that we're going to stay there for the foreseeable future. And in other words, I don't see us just dropping. I think that some people might have the impression that staffing a school is kind of a math problem. You just take the number of kids you've got and you do some basic math, and it helps you determine how many teachers you need and how many staff. And it's far more complicated than that. There are two very important parts of really deciding what your staffing needs are in any district. One of those are the needs of the students in your schools. Those very students, not theoretical, but the kids that are here today. And the other thing that has a major factor in your staffing are community expectations. Those two things have a lot to do with the way that you staff your school. Our school, like most schools, districts, have these things in common that we take into consideration when we begin to build our staffing needs. We have students with special needs. We have students with emotional needs. We have students that are above grade average. We have students that are below grade average. We have students that are gifted and talented. We have students that have health challenges, very unique and serious health challenges. We have students with limited English proficiency. We have students that are heading to college and university at graduation. We have students that are on a vocational track and preparing to go into the trades after high school. I mean, those are just some of the examples of the things that you factor in when you start looking at, well, what are our needs? In addition to that, our board has general guidelines for staffing classrooms, but that's all they are, is our guidelines. And we look at those and we honor those guidelines each and every year. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage for the discussion tonight about our staffing, to just point out that it's a fairly complex, somewhat, it has to be personalized, and that's what we've tried to do. So I think that I'll pass it off to you at this point, Ken.
Okay.
way? You want to go, John, or you want me to go?
I'll take it from here.
Okay.
So, one of the things I wanted to do tonight, in particular, we're gonna talk about the student enrollment and the impacts that it has, as well as some of the collective bargaining and labor costs associated with that. Part of this has to do with really an effort to try to understand, the budget and what the sort of constraints are when you build a budget. So, but before we get started, I actually wanted to give just a little overview of what I'm hoping to cover tonight. I'm going to give a little introduction to our budget this year and where we stand about it. I want to stop before we get into that and just see if anybody has any broad questions about the budget, either about tonight or what's upcoming, so that we can make sure that we cover those either in tonight's presentation or in future presentations. And for those of you who are watching this, and we don't have a large audience here this evening, please do email those questions to the board. You can find our email addresses on the school website. So this is what we're going to cover. So this is the current school budget environment, as many of you have read. The state funding environment for Cape Elizabeth has not been positive for some time. We had about a 22% cut 2 years ago, a 30% cut in our funding the prior year, and we're looking at about a 40% cut this year based on the current data. And so this is the environment in which state funding exists as we begin to put together our budget. Now there's some wrinkles, and you'll understand how all the state funding and all the pieces of that roll together as we put each of the bricks in place. But I wanted people to understand right out front that that's the environment in which we're building this process, and we now need to talk about, in that environment, these are our constraints about how we put it together and how we make the right decisions in those constraints. So last year, the budget process, we shifted it around, and we really focused on having one big, long workshop where we went from beginning to end in the detailed budget. That's not this workshop. That will be the next one. That's the one that will have all the nitty-gritty of every department and how we're looking at every single detail. The other thing that we did last year that I really liked and expect that we're going to be doing this year as well is we took a look at what really does change in a budget. Those things that you say, wow, that really worked, or we think that's going to work, and here's how we know why that worked, and we want to do more of it. And these are the proposals of the things we say, this is working, let's do more of this, we're getting results. And at the same time, you're also looking for saying, as we do that, what are we going to do less of? Because we don't have infinite resources. The people who are doing that new thing have other things that they do. And so how are you going to balance what you're going to do more of and what you're going to do less of to get better results than you did the prior year? And we had a great discussion about different programs and ideas that made sense to add and other ones that we might let go by the wayside as we sort of progress the programs of the district forward. So this year, we expect to do both of those things. The thing that I'm hoping that will be different a little bit more is I really hope to try and communicate as much as possible the detail of this budget to everybody who wants to understand it. Because of that funding environment that we're in, and because school funding is a big part of local taxes, it's more important than ever that people understand it, we're transparent, and people are engaged in the process so they're not surprised and they understand the decisions that we're making and the constraints in which we're making those decisions. So tonight, when we get to the end, I'm going to recap all of the key points from tonight, and I hope to be able to provide a write-up of those key points subsequent to this meeting to go along with this videotape. So that's the process that I'm hoping to follow. I'd like to where am I? All right. Whoops, already skipped ahead. I was going to stop now. If there is anyone, I only see one person. If there are questions from the public about the overall budget, about this budget, anyone who has something to add, or Jamie at this point, I'd love to hear it and see if I can either make sure that it's addressed tonight or in future sessions as we do our presentation. Is there anything? So, not hearing any, we will focus on what is here for tonight. Again, my goal is to really try and explain, for those who want to know what's in that budget, what's in there, how it got put together, and how you can understand the pieces. So, I want to talk a little bit about the school financial statements. Everyone sees the financial statements and it's like, it doesn't kind of look like any financial statement you might have ever seen before, because it's not. It's different. What we're going to go through on that big workshop is the detailed budget that we work with, sort of an operating kind of document that we do our daily work and planning in, that Catherine maintains in the finance office. And then at the end of that, it all gets sort of cut together and reallocated into what's the state required format. Because the state has a format that you're required to report your budget in. Each one has a category. There's, I think it's what, 11 different
Yes, there are.
categories?
Yep.
And that's actually what you vote on when it goes to vote, and you're voting, and you can actually vote to approve any single category or the entire budget as a whole. That's following the state law, and that budget exists for that state budget approval. That's not a budget we work off of, except that, to the extent that it provides certain constraints and limitations about what can be moved toward the end of the year between one category and the other. But those are the budgets you'll see, the one that you vote on, which is a different cut of this. And then, for people who are more familiar with financial statements and those who maybe aren't, I was going to describe how the school budget, in my experience also, is different than regular financial statements. Every financial statement you see is for a purpose, has a particular audience. So that state budget, that's for the state. They need that. That's what they require, that we need that. When you do your tax accounting, you have different numbers than you have for your own accounting, because you do it for the tax authority. They need to see the certain numbers, that's how they do it. When your company's running its business, the management accounts, they look at different things. They look at it on a different basis. They may look at it daily, weekly, or monthly. They track those things that are important to their business, and they have management accounts. Ours are different. School budgets are different. They're a public entity. There really is no balance sheet. We're a town department. We don't keep a balance sheet. There's no balance sheet and income statement. We keep track of the revenues and expenses. That's it. So you're mostly going to see information about expenses. The revenue piece is sort of handled through the town, conversation with the town and the taxing authority. That's mostly how it happens, not entirely. There are some programs that get direct reimbursement from state and federal sources that are sort of essentially pass-throughs. But mostly what you'll see is a focus on expenses, because that's what we see. We actually don't see a lot of the revenue except in those state and federal programs where the money comes in. Also, different than a business, you get to get your money one time a year. If you run out of money as a business, you don't just stop. You borrow money, you have other money, you distribute resources. School funding is annual, and that has some implications about how you manage things like contingency and unallocated funds, and how you treat unreliable sources of income, because you know you can't come back. It's a one-time thing. So that's what you'll see in the accounting and in the planning, that it's a one-time event. The other thing is it's a mix of requirements and objectives. We want to teach every student the best that we can in our school district. We really do. At the other moment, we have certain things that we must do. You have no choice. These are things that are required by the state or federal authorities or other local authorities that we have to do. Now, in some cases, we may choose to do them at a minimal level to just comply. In other cases, we may do them at a more expanded level that sort of says, well, if we go this far, if we go a little farther, everybody can benefit. And so we make those choices around those requirements, but that's what determines what's in there. So if you're going to have a reading program and you're going to serve these certain students, you might decide, well, you know, if we just do this a little bit bigger, we could get a real benefit for a lot of kids, and so we may do things like that as an example. So when you're looking at line items and other things in the budget, it's important to remember all of these factors, that is something that is based on a requirement we must comply with and we're only minimally complying now? Is this something that's required and we're doing something more than that? Or is this really discretionary? There's a mix of that in all these budget items. And we're going to talk about some of them that are more fixed, particularly tonight. And then the last bit is it all comes together at the end. It all comes together and gets recut into those 11 categories that you can see for regular instruction, for all the different 11 categories that you vote on. That's how it all comes together. That's what's in the financial statements that we're going to see. So, collective bargaining and labor costs. Catherine actually has some handouts around this.
I have one colorful one.
And I would want to make the point,
You wanna go ahead?
this is one of the largest parts of schools' expenses is the labor costs and benefit costs to go along with that. Nearly every employee, not all, but nearly every employee operates under a long-term contract. There are exceptions, but there are not that many. There are teachers under probationary contracts, there are some people who don't work under long-term contracts. But for the most part, everybody's under a 3-year contract. Those 3-year contracts have specific terms and conditions in them. So if you hire a teacher, you're under that contract. You can decide how many teachers you may hire. But as we'll see, there are some constraints around that depending on what you're trying to achieve in your school. And some labor costs, as we're going to talk about in a minute, also vary a lot, vary some with enrollment, and others vary not hardly at all. When you open the building, you're going to have the same number of custodians, whether you have 300 people in the building or 500 people in the building. So, Catherine, can you take us through the handout that you just...
What I just handed out is an example of the difference. This shows the big green lines that you see is our staff, is the cost of all of our staff and their benefits. And the little blue dotted section that you see is the rest of the budget. Our budget is primarily staff. Very little of it is not staff. And as you can see over time, the amount of staff has gone up and the rest has gone down. And one thing I wanted to point out that even before we add any new positions, the increase for this new year with just the staff that we currently have because of bargaining agreements is an increase of 4.44%. And that is without increasing anything else. That is just staff and benefits with no new staff included. So we wanted to let you guys be aware of that.
So people can't quite see at home, but reading across the top line is about, for one significant figure, 80%, 80%, 81%, 81%, 83%. In terms of the total budget that is subject to collective bargaining agreements. Now, there's a piece of those ones where the school board actually has almost no control over, and that's the benefit number. We're signed up for the benefit number, and we don't know what that increase will be. Now, we've done some things in our collective bargaining agreements to try and limit our exposure to that as best we can. But we don't know what that number will be. The other thing that's relevant to the collective bargaining agreements, too, is a policy that we have in Cape Elizabeth that's not written in our policy manual, but has been our approach to teaching. We think we have some of the finest teachers in the state, and we really want well-educated, long-term teachers. And as a result of that, we want to attract and retain those really fine teachers. As a result of that, we'll see that our average tenure compared to the rest of the state is more educated and longer term. What that means is, under those contracts, they're going to be more expensive. I'm not foreseeing, and we're open to discussion, a change that we're going to want less educated teachers or ones that are here longer. If we had all 3-year teachers, it'd be a lot cheaper, but I don't know that we'd necessarily be much better off for it. So while there's things you can do, the constraints around some of these collective bargaining agreements and what you're trying to do with your teachers and your education and what you've already got and are trying to be a steward of as you go forward, really preserve what's excellent, does limit some of what you can do. So school enrollment and projections, this is Catherine's other handout.
It's two-sided.
Yeah. So we're handing out the enrollment projections, and you can sort of see what those look like. And before I sort of get into this summary piece of the enrollment projection slide, I think it'd be worth stopping for a minute, maybe to hear from both Jeff and Troy, who are here from the high school and the middle school, just about, how your staffing changes with student population, because honestly, even though we've had these drops, any particular year, you're not seeing drops that are more than single-digit percentages. So recently, it's been between 1% and 3%, I think.
Right, so, I think the point is really the one that you made, John, that there's a lot of costs that are quite fixed, that really are almost independent of what the enrollment is, and that's true of things like the number of secretaries that we need, the number of ed techs we need in any given year has very little to do with the total student population of the high school. It really has to do more with what you talked about in terms of serving individual student needs, because most of those are ed techs that we hire for students who have special needs and are identified and therefore are entitled to a level of services that we need and want to provide those students. In the high school in particular, what happens with students is, marginal changes up or down, even by as many as 20 to 30 to 40 students, don't translate into one-to-one sort of potential staff reductions. And similarly, if we have those kinds of increases, they don't necessarily translate into one-to-one increases either. And the reason is because, and this is my mantra that longtime veteran board members have heard me say, and I'll say a number of times in this budget process, is that I believe and have always believed, and I think I'm right, that Cape Elizabeth fortunately wants to have a small, comprehensive, high-performing high school, and really school system, but high school is my particular area of experience. So what happens as a result of wanting to have a small, comprehensive high school, there are different students who come in at different places academically, and they have different needs. And some of them are very high-performing in certain areas, some of them are lower-performing. Some of them are, the ones who are high-performing in some areas might be lower-performing in others. So literally, when our ninth graders come in, they're all taking, for example, physics. But we have three flavors of physics, essentially. We have honors physics, we have college prep physics, and we have physical science. So immediately, just right off the bat, if, for example, next year, we're going to have an increase of about 30 to 40 students, but those 30 to 40 students, all at ninth grade, are going to be spread out among 3 different levels of classes. So it doesn't necessarily mean we get 30 or 40 students that we automatically add 2 sections of science teachers. And similarly, when we have reductions of 30 to 40 students, it doesn't mean that that changes in the downward direction either. And the same thing repeats itself in every single area. In math, where kids, literally freshmen, can start in, there's probably at least 6 to 8 potential classes that students can take when they begin high school math, and similar changes up through, so that those changes get sort of spread out and dissipated. And the same thing is true in foreign language, and it's really true in essentially every area that we have. Over time, when there are, over a long term, reductions, there are reductions that we do when we can do them. Since in the last 8 to 10 years, thinking back to what we used to have, as our population reduction has gone down, I know that we have lost part-time positions, partial cuts, not full-time teachers, but partial reductions in our computer science staffing, our art staffing, our choral music staffing, our theater staffing, our math staffing, our science staffing, and our English staffing. So all of those are lower now as a result of sort of a long-term change, but it hasn't been sort of proportional. And next year, when our student population is going to go up, there's also not going to be a proportional increase that we're requesting, because we have some ability to absorb increases as well. So that's the good news. We also have reduced over the last several years one fixed cost, and we've had to work hard at it, and I give our secretaries a lot of credit. At one time, we had 6 secretaries in the high school. We now have 4. So that's been a significant reduction. And so that's kind of what happens. And one of the things that's happened, the other thing that's happened over the past 3 years in particular, as we've had some populations, reductions, is that it has allowed us to add in and pilot some programs that we think have made a real difference with kids. So for example, our freshman academy classes, which have been, I think, really successful in terms of supporting students the last few years, were really made possible with no increase in staffing, but a redeployment of staffing because of some reductions in overall student population. So that has been added. The other thing that gets added sometimes, and it goes up and down, it fluctuates, is the support that we have for students through the Achievement Center. Goes up or down, depending on what student population is and what we can manage. So this year, for the first time in quite a few years, we do have an English and a math teacher in the Achievement Center every single period of the day. Next year, we probably will not. So that's one of those things that we provide more or less support for. So those are just sort of some examples. I don't know if anybody has any questions about any of those. I think I think those are pretty much the points I wanted to make.
Jeff, I'm
Yes.
sorry, why is it that the achievement period support fluctuates from one year to the next?
So the connection is that our full-time teachers teach 5 classes. So some time ago, teachers, and they teach 5 classes, and then most of them have a study hall. So they're essentially on duty 6 periods out of our day. Some years ago, when our English and math teachers came to us and proposed that they would be willing to be assigned to the Achievement Center 2 periods in exchange for teaching one less classroom roster of students. They continue to work with students in the Achievement Center, and in fact, they're very busy in the Achievement Center, but it looks different. So that's why, like, this year, we've been able to staff every period except one, I think, in the Achievement Center. Next year, we may lose one more period because we probably are going to have to, I'm guessing, add some teachers because I haven't requested an increase in staff in English and math.
Is that due to the large incoming?
Because
class?
because this year, there's about 40, we have a small senior class, one of the smallest senior classes since I've been here, leaving, and one of the largest incoming freshman classes that's come in the last 10 years or so. So our student population will actually be going back about 7 or 8 years in one sort of fell swoop. But again, because that gets dissipated over lots of different sections and lots of different discipline areas, it's not that I need to ask for an increase one-to-one. It's not like, for example, the elementary school, where kids go into one class and it's closer to a mathematical formula. It's still not quite a mathematical formula, but it's closer. Sure.
Anything, Troy?
Good job. It's a little hard for me because I obviously don't have the historical reference. I mean, I kind of have it now with this sheet a little bit, but the only, I would echo everything Jeff said with the exception of the difference being kind of sections and course work at the high school level. And at the middle school, it's really about kind of educating the whole child. Not that it's not at the high school, but it's really about social, emotional, wellness, trying to make sure that there's good connections made and fitting in, which sometimes doesn't always correlate directly, as the elementary school might a little more, I'm not really sure, to the one-to-one type thing. So, yeah, Jeff is going to be picking up some extra of our students, but it would be wrong to think that we could just lose that support because it's not just those 20 kids leave, and that teacher's impact is only on those 20 kids. And I'm looking forward to it as an opportunity to support some other kids in a different way. So it's not really that clean and easy. For us, it's really about developing programs and services and trying to increase those and really try to prepare kids so that when they get to the high school, they're ready to take off and go and require maybe less support.
So I'm going to ask sort of a question that I sort of know the answer to, but I think it's explained because it's sort of been raised other different places, which is I look at your staffing and I see all these people, they're not teachers. Can you talk a little bit about how your schools are staffed relative to the way things might have been staffed much longer ago when the majority of people in schools were classroom teachers?
Right, sure. So my history doesn't go quite back that far. But just in the time that I've been in education, I mean, there are students who come in who have who are special services students who are identified with IEPs, and those IEPs identify the services that those students need and that we want to serve them with. And sometimes there's the most significantly disabled students oftentimes have intensive staffing needs, in particular around ed tech staffing needs. So I think we have six. So in the high school, for example, we have 6 ed techs assigned to our special education department, serving, supporting some of our most significantly needy students, as they should be. That did not exist when I was going through high school, or when most of us were going through high school, probably. So we also have, I don't remember in the distant past having social workers that one could go to in high school. I apologize. We now have 2 social workers in the high school, and again, it's not that the needs didn't exist when we were in high school. It really is that schools are expected to and want to do a better job supporting students. And one of the reasons why I think that we are able at Cape Elizabeth High School to have a very high graduation rate and a very low dropout rate is because a lot of those students in the past who were not able to get social work or emotional support in school would disappear and would become statistics. And so those are a couple of categories. There are also, in the high school, for example, we have students, and this is, again, it comes back to what individual students need to be successful in school. We have essentially the full-time equivalent, I won't get into the details of it, of 1 staff person who supports kids who need additional support around executive skills, primarily around work completion, but also around just keeping themselves organized and those sorts of things. Those didn't exist. And again, it's not that those needs didn't exist, but the services didn't exist. And I do think it's part of being a small, comprehensive, high-performing public high school that causes us to need to and want to serve those students. We also have a much more expanded, this doesn't really result so much directly in staffing. I was going to talk about extracurricular programs, but that's another part of the staffing that we have. I don't know if you want me to address that at all, John, or not here.
I think it's somewhere relevant, but that doesn't drive your basic
No, it
staffing
doesn't.
decisions.
It does not.
Only to a very small degree around the specific athletic department
Exactly.
teachers. Most of the rest of that is handled as a stipend basis piece of the budget, and it shows up actually not in the collective bargaining agreement pieces, but elsewhere.
Well, and the other part, and Jessica can speak much more knowledgeably to this than I can, in the realm of special needs, we have in the high school, we have a speech and language pathologist. We have a psychologist who's primarily assigned at a high school, I think, who does evaluations connected with students who may have special needs. We have a part-time physical therapist in the high school, occupational therapist, and what else am I forgetting? BCBA, which is a behavioral expert to help with students with behavior issues. So a lot of those extra folks who didn't exist 20, 30, 40 years ago are people who are there because, again, getting back to legally, we're required, all school systems are required to provide those services, and ethically, we want to, because we want those students to have the best chance we can give them of graduating from high school and going on to what they can go on to.
I think there's also the whole technology
Yes.
change.
Yep.
You have the tech
Yep.
staff and the technology integrators and all of those kind of positions also add. Obviously, we want to have the highest level of technology available to our kids. We want to expose them to those skills and develop them. So that's above and beyond the class. It's part of the classroom, but it goes above and beyond that and the requirements for staffing to do that. So it's a wide range of personnel.
So let me see if I can wrap that all in a bow for a little bit to see if, because this is based a little bit on my own experiences. What I would describe it partially as is part of the reason those are legally required is because that's what's effective. And that's what those kids need to get access to education. And we do all these things. We have an increase, in particular since about 1970 when the law changed in special education, and a lot of other things have come in, and when technology also really started to come in. We do these things that are non-classroom teachers, because it's effective for education. You have reading specialists who focus on reading, because that's what the kids need. You have technology specialists who focus on technology, because that's what they need to learn better. We have this level of specialization that we didn't have before, that's not classroom teachers, even those pieces, those social emotional pieces that keep them in school and keep them learning. And if you go then and even look through to things that the state wants you to have, and in their funding formula, they allow for most of this, sometimes at different levels, and you have to make your own decisions about it, but it's not classroom teachers, there's a whole level of specialized folks in education that enhance the education of all those kids in the school. So it's not all about time in that classroom with that classroom teacher, it's about having those kids ready to learn and carry their learning on forward, and that's what the research, from my understanding, has shown to be effective. And it's part of why it's required. Is that,
Absolutely,
okay.
yes.
So, when you look at staffing in our district and in our schools, please keep that in mind. We do this so that the education is as effective as possible. And now I wanted to return a little bit to the forecasting numbers that we had. And particularly the last couple of years, where it's been really flat. The thing I wanted to focus on, and we didn't have a chance to get this data, and we may try and update some of this. If you look back and actually compare times when there's a few times when it went up a little bit, and it went down, but you look at what the forecasts were for our incoming classes, whatever, and there have been a number of different methods that were used in the past. But in almost all cases, the prior year's number was better than the forecast amount. So if it was forecast, if the number went down 20 students, the forecast was for 30 or 40. If it went up 10, forecast was up 10, it went up 3. So if you, when I went back and looked at the forecast actual, it was relatively compelling that no matter what you did, last year's number, the simple, just use last year's number, was more accurate than whatever forecasting methods that we'd been using for many years. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't better methods than using last year's number, but particularly in the period where we're in now, where things have been relatively flat, I think that will be even more so, and that's where we stand today in terms of how we're looking at our forecast, in terms of looking at flat. Now, what happens is the bulges in the different classes move around, and so teachers and other resources and all that individual customized staffing that Howard talked about, those move around, but the overall enrollment numbers and the overall staffing numbers that will sort of relate to that piece will be in a relatively narrow range if your student population is flat. You're not going to see big changes in staffing until you're getting to numbers that are 10, 20% changes in student population, and we haven't had that in ages. Even when we're in our declines, they're still relatively modest. The biggest drop here is what, 1847 to 1800? That's 40 out of 1800. What is that? But not even 10%. It's like
Less
it's
than
about
3.
6%. So 40 out of 1800, 1847. So
I need a
18
Come on,
calculator.
Kathy. Come on,
I don't do it in
Kathy.
my head, never have.
It's about-
I'm great with
about two-
computers.
I'm making you
Again,
do
the
this.
percentage drops are not that, on a percentage basis,
Yeah, I was
they're
gonna
not that
say,
big. So
it's
when you look at this
1.8.
graph here, remember, that's not 0 here at the bottom, that's 1450. If you stretch this out and had 0, this would look flat. So that's why we're using right now a flat number. We think it makes sense, and we're interested to know, and I think it has a lot of implications for how we run our schools in our town, what we expect those student populations to be in the future. But for the foreseeable future, flat numbers makes a lot of sense right now for our budgeting purposes. Now, this is where we get to questions on any of the material that we've covered tonight.
what that historical variance of budget to actual actually has been, because I know that there are some years where we forecast something and then all of a sudden there's either an influx or an outflow of students. So it sounds like, relatively speaking, it generally comes out in the wash.
So my recollection, looking at the data that I looked at, it's been a little while since I looked at it. If you were forecasting a relatively large or small increase or decrease, you tended to get about half to a third of it in actuality. So the year that we went down 40, I think that the number was probably, the forecast was probably for 60 or 80 per drop, something like that. It was.
The other question I'm just curious about on historical enrollment.
Yep.
Is, and Jeff, maybe you can speak to this, I don't know, but, so, there was that one really small class that traveled through from 14, 15 to graduating this year,
Correct.
right?
Yep.
But, so if you remove those as significant outliers, the high school numbers are remarkably consistent. But it appears that, well, I guess if you keep going back across the diagonal, that is pretty, it looks like one class from '08, I guess what I'm saying is it looks like one class from '08 to '18 has, if you took out that one class, it even flattens it out quite a bit.
Yes, it would.
So,
It would not surprise me.
but I mean, the impact was really felt when, I mean, there must have been a few kids that left the district, you know, going from middle school to high school in 14.
So, yeah, my recollection is that both population and student population numbers have been relatively flat and followed overall housing. The big bump was when they built Cross Hill, when that was all new housing development, family-oriented development. You saw a bump in student populations then. The things that, as we've talked about, and this is not data from the school department, this is things I've looked at myself, that the changes have been, some of the drop in birth rates that happened with the recession that have come back somewhat, and that overall family sizes are down. Part of that's due to the drop in birth rates, part of that's due to people are living longer, and part of that was due to the real estate freeze where older folks who might have otherwise sold stayed in their homes for several years. But long-run trends are gonna track with family size and total housing units. I mean, you kinda can't escape those long-run parameters. And I think housing units have roughly up a couple, 2 or 3% per year in long-run numbers. So the town planner will know, but it's up some. It's not up nearly. It's amazingly flat compared to South Portland or Scarborough, who have double-digit kinds of numbers over the last 10 or 20 years in terms of housing unit growth.
John?
Yep.
You told me something interesting the other day that, you know, I think it was in your own research, but I think it's worth noting that you said, and you just mentioned it, that as a result of the recession, birth rates dropped. Birth rates supposedly dropped, but that the lag in that period, you know, it wasn't seen until several years out, and so we're beginning to recover, population-wise just now, right? I think that's what you said.
I think that's about right, yeah. So what, in the depths of the worst years of the recession, both nationwide and in Cumberland County, birth rates, and then past recessions, birth rates dropped significantly. And this year, both nationwide and in Maine and in Cumberland County, those rates have come back up in the last few years, but not quite to pre-recession levels. They came up about halfway, and a little bit more since then. I haven't looked at the numbers recently. But what that means is, you sort of like, you grab the pipe and the water stops flowing for a bit, and now that bubble, that squeeze has got to work its way through your system, and that squeeze is about how long it takes for kids to enter kindergarten, and that's, 4 or 5 years. And so 4 or 5 years out of the recession, you're going to see that impact your student population because your birth rates are going to be down. And they have, like I said, and they steadily recovered, so you're going to see it build back up. Other questions? It's going to be easy with something. So I was going to return to one other thing on the collective bargaining agreement. piece for a second before I moved on to the very end, because I wanted to cover this before I went to the recap. So when you look at these numbers and you see the scale of what is in those collective bargaining agreements, once you determine your student staffing, and as we've talked about, there's a narrow range of what you can do with staffing. And it doesn't mean there's zero, but there's a narrow range. What's left over is a small piece of your budget. So when you talk about things like a 1% cut to your total budget, you can't touch this green piece. And in fact, you know this green piece is going up 3 or 4% or more, depending on which benefit number you go. So if that's going to go up, the other piece has got to absorb that increase and then the additional cut. So a 1% cut with no increase, about 6% out of the remaining total, something around that. It's about just ballpark. And that's in the money that is, and even within that, it's less discretionary than you might think, because like I said, you know, your building and grounds costs are still, which is a decent chunk of what's left in there, in terms of your heat and your light and your custodial and all of the maintenance costs associated with your buildings once you open the doors is going to be relatively fixed. So there's a small piece left that you get to play with. And it's not something, you know, and that's where you can really look at how can we move savings around and what can we do. And we're interested in having those discussions to see what's going to be most effective in our challenging funding environment that we're in. Any other questions about the piece that I just talked about? So that's basically it for the content tonight. I wanted to go back and recap a couple of what I thought were the key points that I'm going to try and also write up to go along with this presentation as we post it, which is a brief review of what the environment and process is. We're in an environment where we cannot expect to see state funding that is much above the minimum receiver level. We're down, we've been, you know, cuts of 20%, 30%, now 40% in what we do, on the state side. The good news is those percentages are coming out of lower and lower numbers. There's not a lot of room to cut left in terms of being above a minimum receiver. So, you know, if you want to call that a silver lining, I guess it is. But we're going to try and make this budget as transparent as possible so people understand what is fixed and what we can change easily and what we can't. And the first part of that was some of the things that we wanted to talk about today around what's happening with enrollment and projections and what that means for staffing, and then what's in collective bargaining agreements and how those are going to move, because what's in those collective bargaining agreements is going to go up. I said we've made choices about the teachers we have. They're more educated and they're going to have a longer tenure, and those are more expensive. And those go up the longer people stay. Those are fixed. We don't have control over our benefit costs to some extent. We've limited some of that in what we've done in our bargaining, but those are going to go up. So those are the pieces that we can't move around easily. So all of that comes down to all of those other line items that you're going to see in the budget mostly relate to that other 17% roughly of the budget. Those are the things that we can move around and decide, okay, these are the programs that we're going to try. Now some of that's staffing reallocation, so some of that's a plus here and a minus there. It's a net no cost relative to the budget. But some of that's where the things that we're going to talk about in those programs, saying we want to spend more on this because it works, like Freshman Academy. And there was increased sort of allocation of both resources, existing resources, and that year, and it's been working. So things like that, things that we've seen progress that we want to do more of, and we're also going to be identifying as a result, we're going to spend less over here. And that's where we're trying to focus the discussion, where it's going to have the impact in the money that we can really move around. And again, I asked you to look at the budget, look at the line items, see that you can understand why that's there. There's all kinds of different kinds of personnel. Most of them are there because they make learning more effective. Some of them are also there because they are required. we're interested in hearing what people have to say. We're interested in putting this together in as transparent a process as possible. But we need people who are going to engage with us to understand the environment, the restrictions, and the things that we're trying to operate on to really deliver an excellent education within the parameters that we've, and funding environment that we've been presented. So that's really it, and I want to make sure that the next meeting, the meeting which is going to be the detailed budget workshop is
February 27th, yeah,
February 27th.
I believe.
That is going to be a half day long, and we will go through all of that detail. All of those pieces, and then how it sort of will all roll up into that final state budget. We encourage any and all of you to come and join us for that discussion. We will have a discussion of those programs and things that we're trying to move around, and we'll have some thoughts as to how we can address what we're trying to do in this funding environment. So that's all I have for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Look forward to seeing you on the 27th.
Thank you, John.
5 o'clock.
Oh, do you want to?
Yep.
I just have a question about the composition of the teaching staff.
Mhm.
And, so you mentioned that, it's been the district's, objective to have better educated, longer tenured. Do we have any model that we sort of follow for the right load balancing within that? And I guess what my question is really getting to is, do we have the appropriate mix of, sort of veteran teachers, but also, what I would describe as more up-and-comers and things like that? And not only for what the financial implications are of that, but also for the right mix of, people that bring new ideas and different perspectives and things like that. And I just didn't know if you guys have any specific model that you try and achieve in regard to that.
Do you want to speak?
I'm not aware of a model, but you go ahead and answer.
So what I will say, as we head into this budget season, those types of parameters are the things and thinking that need to underlie all of your contract negotiations as you enter into the collective bargaining agreements. And there were discussions around some of those points this year, but you end up with the agreements that you end up with. And those are what we say, we're signing up for this, this is a good deal, and we're gonna live with it. But yes, I think that actually is an important conversation to have as you head into each bargaining round.
May I speak
Yeah.
to this? Yeah, I think it's a great question, Jamie. I don't believe that we have a stated objective if we want X% of our faculty to be at a certain place in their career. But I think that it would be difficult for our Human Resources Department to crank out our teachers, for example, by how many of them are within a certain number of years of experience in teaching. Not necessarily their age, but years of actual teaching, which could be here or elsewhere. I know that last year we hired teachers with, I believe, little to no experience, and we hired a teacher with many years of experience. So our rule of thumb has been, let's get the best teacher that we can, and we don't assume anything. I mean, I think that some people may have the impression that if a teacher's got a lot of experience, they're kind of not particularly creative or innovative, and as you and I both know, that's unfair. It's not true. We have teachers that are very much out there learning more and coming back with great ideas that have got a lot of experience, and we have teachers, but I totally agree with you. There's something very dynamic and exciting about bringing in people with new experiences, new ideas, some different universities. It's just wonderful. The one thing we have talked about is it would be highly desirable to start attracting teachers that are minorities. We think that would be enriching for our students and for our community as a whole. It's been nothing more than talk, but it is something that we have discussed, and I think it's an exciting possibility, but it would maybe be something that we would work on in concert with neighboring districts to see if we could collectively attract more teachers from different ethnic and religious backgrounds to model as teachers in our schools.
I'll add one other thing. So this is an area that was of interest to me, and I would point, actually, anyone who's interested, 4 years ago in December 2013, the state legislature commissioned a report from Lawrence Pikus.
Yes.
They touched on this topic in the second part of the report. The second part of the report is what I'd recommend to you, which summarizes the first part of the beginning of it. One of the things they said, which is why I would tread into this area very lightly, because they basically mentioned the same issues in terms of teacher effectiveness and reward, and they basically said, every school district they've ever seen who tries to handle this sort of incentive-based or this sort of balancing piece on their own has been miserably disappointed. And so before I would tread there as a district, I would be a little bit cautious on that score, based on that. And these are people who work all over the country and were very smart about how you put together fair and effective education programs. And so that's a point in the Pikus report when they're referring particularly to teacher compensation and some of the commentary.
I guess a follow-up question I would have is, do we have any visibility as to how our staff measures relative to peer communities on that average tenure and
Yes,
experience?
we have it. We should actually publish along with this school data, information both about the raises and levels of, this is sort of the material we prepare for collective bargaining, where we stand in terms of surrounding communities, in terms of that, for each of the different levels and increases. And my impression is that we are definitely in line with where we, with our peers in the region. And we should publish that as additional information with the budget, because I think that's it. Because it's such a large piece of what we do, that we've been sensible about it is important to be transparent about.
Thank you.
Yep.
So this is really for Catherine. When will the board have budget binders?
I am trying to get them out by next Friday, the 16th. That's my goal.
And a kind of a follow-up comment. It would be useful if the budget binders that are provided to the town council are different
Okay.
from the school board, which I didn't realize they have been. I got into a little difficulty last year not realizing that the town council got a different budget binder than the school board. And so if we aren't seeing the same things, I think it would be useful to at least know, like, okay, this is gonna be different, or that's gonna be different, that way. That way, we're not talking about apples and
I totally get that.
pineapples.
And my goal this year is what I'm gonna give you, like, update saying, here, replace this page with this page, because as we go along, things change, we update figures and stuff, and so my plan is to have everything numbered and collated into certain areas, so that you should be able to just replace any changes, so that the binder, when the council does get their binder, you will have everything that they have too.
Great.
I think I'd emailed it as an electronic document, and it kinda got lost in the shuffle, and,
It's not
So.
meant at all, it was not meant at all.
But I
Like,
underst-
you
yeah.
didn't do this.
Yeah.
I think that there has been a tradition or a practice that, the council got this sort of information, and maybe they didn't get it to this degree, but the board got it this way, and it was very detailed, or whatever, and so
Okay.
what I saw happen to myself on camera, was like, oh, I don't have this and you do, and it was just different. It's not bad, it felt bad, but not angry. I think it would just be useful for all of us.
Duly noted.
Thank you.
And Catherine, one more question. I forget, around roughly what time did the health figures come in?
April 1st is what Howard and I were trying to remember from last year. Yep. So we're hoping that that's when they come in this year too.
Thank you.
I just have a curiosity question, I think you can answer this. Do we keep the data of the students who are residents of Cape, but they go to other district for schools, to other public schools, and we have a stipend for them? Is that somewhere kept, those?
That, actually, I believe, Andrea, our data, has that data. It's actually online through the Department of Education. We do not receive any money for any of the
No, we
children
don't,
that.
we do give money, right?
No, we do not pay
So if
tuition.
someone from Cape Elizabeth moves to Baxter Academy,
If they, we do not pay any money towards that,
Okay.
no. Because we have a high school of, like, if it's a high school student, because we have a high school of record,
okay,
they don't have an option for us to pay for tuition to any other school.
okay.
Their option is to come here.
For students to go to the vocational school.
That's the only option, because we don't offer those courses here. We have an agreement with the vocational school in Portland, but that's it. Is that it?
Do we know
We
how
good?
many, roughly, just ballpark number, how many kids live in town that don't attend Cape Elizabeth schools?
I do not know off the top of my head.
How many attend what? Pat?
How many,
That-
how many kids live in Cape Elizabeth that don't attend our schools? Do we have a ballpark on that?
Well, see, it depends on what you're counting, because if there are children that are homeschooled, for example.
Right.
So would we count them in
Yeah,
that?
sure. So
Right.
school-age children that do not actually
Yeah.
matriculate in
We
our
can
schools.
get that, we don't.
I'd just be curious.
Howard, correct me if I'm wrong, but in my mind, the ballpark number of the total homeschool and otherwise is about 20 kids.
I just don't know.
I don't know for sure, but I feel like
Last time I
that's.
saw it was 24,
I
but
can't-
I don't
yeah,
wanna
I'll
say
get
it
it.
I feel
and
like,
be wrong.
yeah, not,
but
but I think that's a
That
ballpark.
includes private schools, homeschool, yeah. We'll have to check.
But we can get that for you.
It would be interesting too, not to make a lot of work for somebody, to track if that number's gone up in correlation with any of the enrollment decline. So in other words, is
Right.
the overall student population even flatter than this? It's just that they're choosing not to go to a Cape Elizabeth school for one reason or the other. Does that make sense?
I know that at the high school, Jamie, typically we count on whatever the middle school's student population is in grade 8. Now, I don't know how many students before grade 8 are in non-Cape Elizabeth schools, but in terms of that transition, usually it's a neighborhood of 5 to 8 students
Yeah.
who choose to go to a charter school, a Baxter school, or Chevres, or some of the other options. That's historically been a pretty safe number for our sort of thinking about things. But I do know that the superintendent's office has, I think, detailed information about all the students, all the grade levels. And I was actually anticipating, when the state increased or made charter schools possible, particularly Baxter and a couple of others in the Portland district, that there might be a significant increase in that number, and there really wasn't. There was sort of temporarily, but it's sort of stabilized at this point. That's my impression anyway. It's not data.
You might find those small sample numbers follow opportunity as opposed to population. So when Baxter opens, you may see a big number change versus.
Sure.
Yeah. They are, I think it was like in the teens to 20s, the times that I've seen the numbers, I think. But we should get that data to publish it. Track it.
Seeing no other questions, is that right? All right.
I do. Did we capture the data that, I just want to circle back with you at the end of this to make sure we captured the data requested that we just had.
Yes,
Okay.
that Jamie was asking
Yeah.
regarding students not attending Cape schools.
So thank you, everybody, for attending. We look forward to the next budget workshop on the 27th.
27th, at 5 o'clock.
At 5
It's
o'clock.
5 to 8:30.
Thank you.
Or thereabouts.